Time to bring in our panel of political strategists this Monday afternoon. Grahame Morris here with me in Canberra, Bruce Hawker in the Sky News Centre. Welcome to you both. Now, I just want to get your overall sense of how the Prime Minister in particular and the government are travelling. I mean, it's been a remarkable turnaround, yes, in some of the polls, but also in a lot of the commentary as well. And that's clearly flowing through to the confidence of Tony Abbott, Grahame. He's been out and about Joe Hockey too, when he's not in court, holding forums, talking to people about their issues and trying to address them. The PM's over in WA now after appearing on the New South Wales campaign trail with Mike Baird yesterday. What do you think? Is all of this a good idea?
Well, I think it is. I always found with leaders I work with that after they had a rough period in Canberra, and if there was a bit of an upswing, there is nothing better than getting out in the shopping centres, going to schools, going to the troops, and you get a different reception. And also, what is important, you raise some money for your marginal seats members at functions, but your marginal seat members also see the reaction that the Prime Minister and the Treasurer get from real people. That's always different to what you get in Canberra. And it sort of strengthens everyone's resolve. It's good.
I mean, we should point out they're still very careful about all that. I mean, we're seeing pictures of him today at a winery in WA where he's clearly been invited. He's not exactly strolling through a shopping mall taking all comers.
Yeah, well, I used to like schools because you get 4 cameras at a school and you will have an excited riot.
It doesn't matter who's there.
That's right. That's right. I could do it.
Well, Bruce,
but it is good for everyone. It's good for the members on the ground, the politicians on the ground. It's good for the members of the party, and it's good to strengthen the PM and the Treasurer.
Bruce, you when you looked after Kevin Rudd, you used to put him out there in shopping malls and that sort of thing, but I'm sure you only did it when you were sure he'd get a pretty strong reaction.
Well, generally we were pretty confident we'd get a good reaction. I mean, there were times when he didn't, and that was never particularly pleasant, but you can't control the cameras at all times. I think Abbott will do as much as he can to constrict or confine his media appearances to areas where he's not going to get the interjectors, because there's no doubt that he's still very unpopular. I don't think we should get carried away with any of this. I mean, he's got a long, long way to go before he really wins back the support of the public. I think for the Labor Party this is a good thing in a sense, because they'd rather him there than anybody else. But I think he is doing what he should be doing, and that's trying to sell a new message, because I don't think it's just the messenger.
Is he doing that? I mean, do you think it's a new message? We saw last week, Bruce, the GP co-payment killed off, defence pay improved a little, and the intergenerational report released, which shows you've actually got a rein in spending. How do you think is the message a better one from the government now, or is it still a little confused? I mean, how do you see it?
Well, in the various specific areas, it probably is a better message. You know, the GP co-payment was just a complete mess and a disaster for the government. No one was happy with cutting the pay of the people that actually defend us in foreign shores. So when you get down to the specifics, I think they did get some support probably for that, as an indication that they are listening to the public about those issues. But then, of course, when you get into areas like the intergenerational report, you get back to the macro sort of story, and it becomes a much less pleasant one, really, for people to have to take in, because it talks about spending restrictions, about making sure you don't move debt into to the next generation to a degree that you can't manage here. So it's fine when you're talking about the specifics and walking away from those, but when you get into those general sort of discussions, it's probably less attractive to the public. They can take it because it's only in generalities, but if it gets down to specifics about further cuts to services and benefits, then I think they will be very unhappy, just like they were before.
That's right, isn't it, Grahame? I mean, it's all well and good to say we've got to rein in debt and spend less. No one's going to disagree with that. But as soon as you put up some specifics, that's when it gets politically tricky.
Yeah, it is hard. But the first step, I think, and they missed this in the first time round, and that he's running around saying, essentially saying that the Scouts motto, we'll do our best, and now he's sort of adding the other ingredient, which is, look, we're going to be very careful further down the track that we don't reduce the number of people who can get a pension, reduce the number of people who can go into hospital, reduce the number of people who are on Medicare, simply because we've still got to pay off blinking debt. You know, you could harden it up. Nobody's going to like this, but you could harden it up and say that Bill Shorten loathes other people's children and can't stand other people's grandchildren. Otherwise, why would you saddle them with all this debt the poor people are going to cop?
Let's talk a little bit about one of the ideas that Joe Hockey in particular floated over the weekend, although I know the Prime Minister today said they have no plans to do this at the moment, allowing, I presume, younger first home buyers to dip into their super to put down a deposit on a home, help them get a foot into the housing market. Now, on the surface, Grahame, sounds good, but once you start eating into your super, that has a long-term impact as well. What do you reckon?
Well, it's a bit of a Sydney policy, this one, because young people are really struggling in Sydney and parts of Melbourne to get into the market. And here they are sitting with their little nest egg. So you think, oh, that's good. But I was brought up with that school that this super thing is for later in life. And the minute you dip into it, then you've got less for later in life, and that's the problem. I honestly don't know what the answer to this is. It's been talked about right back, I think, to John Hewson's Fight Back. I think it was in there. Let's have a look at this. And we go backwards and forward. I don't know, but I think it's probably time we had another look at this to see if there's something in it or not.
Maybe it's worth a look at it, but Bruce, there's also, I guess, the issues. Young people won't have a huge amount sitting in their nest egg account at that age, will they?
That's exactly right. And as Chris Bowen, the Shadow Treasurer, pointed out today, it could have an unintended consequence of further inflating the housing market in areas where it already is really overblown. So we've got to be careful about unintended consequences of a move like this if it does.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think this has got to be thought through very carefully. It's something which they do in Singapore, but they have a lot more public housing, and it's a much different system in Singapore. But they've always allowed access to superannuation there for families if they want to build a home. So look, it's not without precedent, and it should be considered. But I think you need to be very careful about it because it could have unintended consequences.
I want to talk to you both about the ongoing issues around trying to stop young Australians heading off to join ISIL. Peter Dutton today pretty strongly saying parents need to keep an eye on what their kids are doing online and people they're talking to. If they have any suspicion at all, they should reach out to authorities. Bruce, you first on this one. It's a pretty powerful message and a sensible message, I suppose. It can't be easy for parents in that situation to dob in your own kid, but what's the alternative? Ending up heading over there and getting killed.
Yeah, look, I think the people who are going to have the closest idea of what their children are thinking about are their parents. More so certainly than other members of the community. Maybe their peers would have a better idea, but the parents are there with them hopefully on a day in, day out basis. And we've told parents to be aware of kids and drugs and alcohol and all sorts of other antisocial activities. Then I think it makes perfect sense to be saying, listen, you've got a responsibility not only to the child but to society and to your own community to make sure that if they are showing signs of being seduced by this abhorrent ideology, that you've got to rein them in and you've got to go and talk to people who can help you in that regard. I think it's a good measure. I think there's a limit to what can be done, frankly, but I think this does make sense that families should be looking at it, and maybe some of these families have got to be looking at what they're saying themselves and what people in their own communities are saying to them as well, and be prepared to engage with people who are preaching this sort of radicalism, and just tell them that this is just bad for the Islamic community, it's bad for Islam, and it's certainly terrible for these young people who get seduced into it and end up being cannon fodder in some war that is not theirs.
Yeah, Grahame, Bruce is right. There's a limit to what can be done in stopping this entirely, but everyone needs to do whatever they can, I suppose. Parents, the government too, they're going to be launching an online campaign soon.
Yeah,
it's not an easy thing to do.
I thought Bruce is right. How do you stop teen terrorists? The parents certainly have a role. The community leaders have a role. I think in this case the religious leaders have a role. And I think it's one of the reasons why we ought to be allowing the Federal Police and ASIO just to have a look at people's emails, Twitter, you know, all the social stuff, because a lot of it is coming from there.
Well, look at everybody's emails and Twitter.
Well, you've got to have a good reason. You've got to have a good excuse. But you know, otherwise, you know, we're going to have a whole army of teen terrorists chuffing off overseas and eventually coming back here well trained. That's
and what about the government's online campaign here? As I say, I don't think it's going to be an easy thing to tailor, because if it has any whiff of this is the government telling you not to do this, I mean, that's hardly going to work.
Yeah, I understand that. But you know, what we've said is that each one of those sort of levels, government, community, everyone's got to have a go at this and try and convince these kids to come back to work.
And maybe if it's tailored more at the parents and the peers of these kids to say, these are serious matters, you should look out for these signs.
Well, that's right. But I think we've all got to accept it's never going to be 100% foolproof.
No, correct. No. Grahame, you're in Bali not long ago. I want to hear your thoughts on, how you think the Indonesian president, the Indonesian government are handling the situation around Andrew Chan and Myron Sukumaran, and the Australian government too.
Look, you're right, David. I was in Bali, and the Balinese approach is different to the Indonesians. The Indonesians were were quite furious at Australians. The Bali, sort of different people. They're a bit more laid back. But I wondered, why is it that many Australians are not jumping up and down about the fact that 2 Australians are going to be shot? You know, the politicians are doing their job, but Australians, you know, and it's probably this, I thought, is that, you know, some people think drug dealers are the scum of the earth. Well, I agree. But it seems to be this, and a young Bali bloke explained it to me, that we in Australia, we hate capital punishment and we have laws against it. But we also believe, and it's a pillar of our entire being, we believe in the rule of law. And the Balinese young bloke said to me, how would you feel if somebody in Australia, a Balinese or Indonesian fellow in Australia, was up for murder, and the Indonesian president was saying to our Governor-General or our Prime Minister, hey, can you lower it to manslaughter or let him off with a big fine? We would be furious. And I think that is the funny ingredient in this, is that many Australians think, well, that's the law in Indonesia, and we live by the rule of the law, and we hate the capital punishment thing, but that's the law.
But we surely can still say we don't like that law.
We can, but we should not be
selective about
we shouldn't be surprised when people in Indonesia and Bali were saying, well, hang on, what if it was reversed? And one of our people was up for a serious murder and they wanted it lowered to manslaughter, and asking our heads of government or heads of state to intervene, we would be furious.
Bruce, what do you think about the way, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister in particular, have handled this whole issue? It's been a very strong bipartisan message of condemnation about the death penalty here. Do you give Tony Abbott credit for how he's dealt with it?
Look, I actually give Julie Bishop more credit. I think her language has been very, very nuanced and diplomatic, and I think she's demonstrated some ability there. And I think that's to be, to her credit. I think the bipartisan nature of the, of the representations, with Tanya Plibersek leading that from Labor side, has been, very good as well. I think the problem of, to respond in some way to Grahame's point, and I take a lot of what he's saying as being very accurate, is that it's the finality of the death sentence which is so terrible that requires such a strong response. And I think governments have consistently, and the Indonesian government included, have consistently lobbied overseas jurisdictions when their people have been on death row to try to have their sentences commuted. They're not saying let them free, but they are saying commute them to a life sentence, because we do find it as a nation an abhorrent thing. Now, I don't think we're ever going to overcome those problems, but I don't really know that the government and the opposition or anybody else could have done too much differently to what they did. I think, Abbott was a bit clumsy in some of his language at one point, which the Indonesian government responded to very quickly. And I think, we do have to make sure that we're not sounding like we're trying to coerce them, but rather that we're making a respectful plea on behalf of these young men that no matter how terrible the things that they did were, that it doesn't warrant the death penalty. And maybe that's starting to have some impact in Indonesia. You're hearing the president talk about down the road perhaps some doing away with it. But I think we are entitled to make those pleas on their behalf, and we should.
Well, we'll see how it ends up. We understand, of course, there won't be any execution happening this week or next, but beyond that, of course, it doesn't look good at all for Andrew Chan, Myron Sukumaran, Bruce Hawker, Grahame Morris. Good to talk to you both. Thank you. Take a quick break. Back with more on PM Agenda. Stay with us.